this is Justin, and I'm going to switch to myself here if we can. Call it that. Here I am. I'm going to put a little end to the little trailer that we like to run before the show to let you know we're coming on. In the event that you want to look at earlier versions of it, you can do that right on this same page that you're on, Justin in Mexico, which has that name because God knows it just was something that I had an available blog in, so that's the one I wanted to use. You can either Twitter us if you know how to do that. I'm still a novice at it, but I can read the Twitter stream that comes in. Or you can use the old Alexander Graham Bell phone. You pick it up and you dial, and you'll see the number there, 941-306-1119. And if I haven't spoken to you in a long time, it would be nice to talk to you. And of course, if you're a Skype user, and you call by computer, I can pick that up too. And my Skype ID is SoulSpeakSpring, the same as my Twitter ID. You'll see that on the page that you're looking at these things on. Let me start out by saying I made some claims last show which in fact I didn't back up. I just figured, well, let me just put them out there and see if they swim or sink. And I'm sure for some of the viewers who were looking in, they sank, and maybe for some others they floated, and maybe for a couple of others they started to fly off the water as they should have. But I wanted to have you think for a moment so you can make some sense of what this show is about. Is not as your poetry as literature, since your poetry existed for tens of thousands of years, perhaps hundreds of thousands of years before we learned to read and write. It was an oral art, and it was spontaneous, and it came from a different consciousness than we have now. We have a consciousness that somehow developed with the act of writing, where we have a very strong conscious mind, and a conscious mind that kind of lays low most of the time, but in fact it can erupt, and it usually erupts in what we call psychic events, where it wants to communicate with us. But the thing I wanted you to think of is, at the very root of poetry, no matter whether it's written with our current consciousness or it was spoken out of a more flimsy consciousness. Excuse me. Let me take a drink of my. I'm going to tell you that this is Diet Coke, but it's not. It's the real Coke. I'm sorry. I have to have it. It's not iced tea either, because I'm hooked on all the bad vices of my youth, and I refuse to give them up. The thing you want to think about it is, at the root of your poetry is always that it comes to you unbidden. I'm not talking about the reading of a poem, but the conception of a poem. It just announces itself. It arrives, and you write down as much as you can if possible, or if you're speaking it out, if you've mastered that art. And that's a kind of lost art, but some of us know how to do it, and we can pass it on. It's very natural, really. You just have to become unconscious for a while and stop thinking, and just speak. It will come to you in the form that it came to Homer and all of the poets before Homer. Homer's the only one we know. We have some evidence of his art because it was transcribed at some stage, even though he lived in a non-literate age, through some miracle that it came down to us in the form of writing. Perhaps you tampered with a bit, but the Greeks adored Homer, and it was most likely that they got it right. There were enough people who remembered, and enough other poets who mimicked him, because the kind of epic poets that came after Homer had a much different name, which means they weren't working in the same way as the ancient epic poets. They were called rhapsodists, and I suspect they work like very accomplished musicians like Arthur Rubinstein, basically, who kind of becomes Mozart for the 20 minutes or so that it takes to rip off one of Mozart's numbers, or so he feels. Of course, he's kind of going off a script, and as far as the rhapsodists, at least in the early stages, until the Greeks learned to write, which is about 100 years after Homer's death, they simply mimicked Homer the way that people who are comedians mimic the movie stars. I think Homer was that big, and that's how it was carried forward. I'm going to take another sip because for some reason, whenever I get near computers, I get an itch in my throat. But let me have you just think of that as a psychic event, because that's exactly the nature of psychic events. If we, for some reason, want to believe what we see on TV and the vampires and the crawly, creepy monsters that come out of your nose and all that stuff, then we're going to be lost. But I think if we can do beyond that, if we can think of ourselves beyond that, and if we can think of a psychic event as the unconscious breaking through the veil of consciousness and speaking to us or showing us a picture. When we dream is when the unconscious is in complete control, and what we remember is what we have of the dream. Basically, when we wake up, our conscious mind is able to refashion it in some way. But for all intents and purposes, that our conscious controlling mind is just not there. And so what happens is that it goes on and on, the dreams, and they just play themselves out as movies, basically, little visions of life that are a little screwy in time and space. What we want to think of is that in terms of psychic events are like that, except they come up to us usually in the terms of visions, which is very rare, or they come up in terms of the voices. Now, if you hear psychic voices often, then you're probably schizophrenic. But there's about 2% of the population hears them in terms of stress. They sound like somebody's talking to you, but there's nobody in the room. And they're very authoritative, and they come up and there's a truth to them. There's an authority that you have to listen to. That's very similar to what the poem arrives with, that same authority and that same feeling of truth. We know that it's true, but there's also one other dimension to when the poem arrives, when we hear those voices. They're slightly different voices. They're not commanding voices or guiding voices. They're slightly more human. And I might have to go get a cough drop or something. And they also have an orgasmic quality to them. So that particular type of psychic event is only matched by one other psychic event, and that's the real orgasms that we have. They come unbidden. At a certain stage, we can be kind of mulling around and thinking about mating, whatever it happens to be, but at some stage, we lose control, and it just seizes control of us. And we go through the mating orgasmic process in which we lose our current consciousness and become one with everything that's around us and or our mate. Just the whole thing becomes one, heaven blazing into the head. And then we come back into our current consciousness, and we're looking for a cigarette or something to drink or turn on the TV. But during those few moments when it seizes control of us, it has all the elements of a psychic event. The fact that it has no message except union shouldn't really bewilder us. It's the most animalistic of the psychic messages, being one without words and without specific images. It's just basic mating at its most primal, So I think that we have to consider it like that, and that of all of the psychic events that occur to most people, out of body things, whatever you want to think of them, that the people have in terms of stress, that have a truth to them, even though they can see themselves lying on the floor, and they know what's happening is true. What they are looking at, they have moved out of their bodies. We really can't think of psychic events as hallucinations. I've had hallucinations, and so has anybody who's a child of the 60s. We all dropped acid and everything like that, mescaline, and we know what those distortions are like. The psychic events, the voices and visions that come to us are ordered, and they're also, there's no distortion. What we hear or what we see it has an authority and a truth to it that we just bend to. We acknowledge it. If you've never had one, it's hard to conceive of it, but if you can conceive of somebody who always tells you the truth, and it usually tells you a truth that you're not aware of, some human truth, And then just take your body away, and imagine that voice you're coming in your head all of a sudden with somebody that you've always been to, in the sense you recognize them as giving you very good information, or always truthful information. You'll have some kind of idea of what a psychic voice feels like. At one time in our development, back before we learned to read and write, there seems to be a great deal of evidence that people heard voices all of the time. And that's why you see heroes in all of the epic stories that existed before literacy, talking to the gods, hearing the gods. They're not making it up. That's how their consciousness worked. It was a very thin kind of membrane in which the unconscious, or the soul of the psychic world, was constantly erupting into consciousness with a reality that was always to be obeyed. So poems have the quality of that, something that has to be honored. That's why if you're living next to a poet, whether bad or good, as long as the poem arrives the right way, they can't wait to show it to you. They'll bore you to tears. They'll knock down your door. They'll invite themselves to dinner and then pull it out. Hey, look at this, because instinctively that our psyches, our souls, our intelligences, our conscious intelligence, even way down beneath that, realizes that something has happened that's extraordinary, that something has been given to us that's a message. And the message has a truth and a beauty to it that should not be ignored. That's why they're always showing it to you. Look at this, and you go, oh God, get it away from me, or else if it's really good, you get a little fire yourself, and you light up. So that's important to, in fact, to recognize that a poem has that quality of all psychic messages. It comes unbidden, it has an authority to it and a truth to it, and it has a beauty to it, which is something that you also get in the other messages, but they're more guiding messages. It doesn't have so much of the beauty in it, and that beauty comes from, I believe anyway, after looking at this for a very long time, and I spent many years trying to figure out what is going on between a normal psychic event and the poem's event when it comes to, is that the poem has many of the qualities of an orgasm. It's a more animalistic, more unconscious. It has all of the qualities of a mating, which is what an orgasm is. It's the attempt it's the body's attempt to mate, and hopefully you'll have a mate, and not just nobody in the room. It's always a little better if you have somebody to mate with. But the orgasm is so strong it will come up of its own accord, and in fact will continue, even in fact without a mate. You still have the feeling of heaven blazing into the head, and you lose your current sense of what's going on. And in fact you come back. So that's what happens in a poem. You just lose it. The words start to tumble into your head. Sometimes you hear them, sometimes you see pictures, but it all comes as a coherent story that you try to get down either by speaking it out or by writing it out. So if you think of poems as that, as a primal psychic event, you can begin to take a different look at poetry, as poetry is the way that human beings can, if they wish, they always had in the past, but in fact we go now to psychologists and psychiatrists to try to get our heads screwed up. Well, we stand on our heads and we do all kinds of things. God, you can turn on the TV at 3 a.m, that I'm sure that everybody has their right mind about what we should be doing, but it just looks like a bunch of quacks going on. There are so many ways to straighten yourself out in this world that you should begin to think that something's the matter with all of these techniques. Poetry is the way of establishing a balance between your conscious and unconscious minds. That, I believe, is its really primal function, is to do that, and it does it on the initiation of the unconscious, which realizes that it has to say something to you while you're awake. And it wants to break through, and it wants to bring its message into your genes, if you want to think of it that way, okay? Because the message in a poem is a feeling message. The words just carry the feeling. The feelings are very complex. They can be tragic, comic, they can be static, they can be everything at once. The words are simply the way they're the spear carriers in the opera. Don't really fool yourself about that. That's the feeling is important, and what the psyche wants back, what's the unconscious wants back, I've come to believe, and this is a big statement, is it wants to hear its feelings, okay? You think of it as a feeling entity. It wants to think of it as its feelings made human. It's not listening for the words back. It's listening for the sound of the words, the feeling of the words, what it means when the feelings become human and live in time in the form of a story. All poems are stories. E equals MC squared is a story, as I said before, and so is Hey Diddle Diddle, the Cat and the Fiddle is a story. But there are certain stories that have a urgency to them and that have a beauty to them that moves us and makes us whole again. It reminds us who we are. Very, very complex animals. Close to divine, as the ancient sources say. You know, there's God and there's humans, and the angels are beneath us, and that's very true. You know, the angels are, you can think of them as intuitions and persuasions that come, that kind of thing, that sometimes take form, their guides, but there's nobody like the humans. Everybody wants to hear what the humans have to say. And if you think of it, there wouldn't be any stories about God without humans. There in fact would be no God. So that the great poems of the past eventually became our Bibles and our Qurans and everything else in the world. Let me take another little sip here to try to get rid of this little tickle. I don't know what the hell it is. So when you kind of think of that for a while, you say, well, let's say that it is a psychic event. So what's the importance of it? The importance is it's something that can be done or should be done, or you should open yourself to making poems. Not the kind of poems we see in the quarterlies and in the New Yorker or all that nonsense. You know, they're fine, but they're so conscious that they don't really have the effect on us that you can get by speaking out the poems. And by speaking them out, I mean by creating a narrative, either by speaking or singing or moving or pantomime, whatever you want to do, okay? By allowing the poem to come out in the form that it wants to come out is as a story. But that's what makes us human. We're the only animals who have ever made stories. Not just one story like the bees do or whatever, you know. Or not just present statements like the whales make or the killer whales make or dogs make, whatever it is. I'm hungry, let's mate, whatever. It's just right. They're essentially statements of the present. A story is something that's pulled out of memory, out of the past, and refashioned, in which we make a whole completely new world. No animal does that. Story after story after story after story, until after some hundreds of thousands of years, I think it's very easy to say that human beings are nothing but a collection of stories. Some of those stories are very important stories. And some come to us in our sleep. We call them visions, you know, Book of Revelations, in terms of visions. Some come as dreams that have worked their way into the Bible that we remember because they're so true. Some are told to us by our neighbors. Some are told us by our children. Know something. They tell us a story and all of a sudden our head opens up. It's told by our enemies, by our leaders. They're just stories and stories and stories, and we retain some and forget some. We're like a big leaky bowl, and the stories keep coming in, and some are living out, and some just sit there forever, you know. The story of Jesus is a story that has set for a very long time. And the stories of the various Edens, the various creations, have stuck with us for a very long time. In fact, you don't even have to have books to transmit them. There's stories that, like the nursery rhymes, which is a very good example of something that lives without official critical recognition. They're passed on from mother to child, from child to their children, and their children are so simple. They're 4 or 5 lines, they rhyme, and they contain a very bitter truth that life is funny, but it's also cruel. Jack and Jill ran up the hill to fetch a pail of water. Jack fell down and broke his crown, and you know the rest. There's always mayhem involved in those. So that poems have a way of coming out and of declaring a truth, and in the process of that truth, there's a body truth that comes up, and that body truth is we become one with our unconscious or our soul. The surface mind surrenders and it mates again with its unconscious self. Excuse me. And I said before that we should treat the soul. It's not a new concept. If you read any of the spiritual guides, whether they're religious or whether it's the Catholic or the Baptist or the Hindu or whatever it happens to be, or the Aborigines, is the unknowable, the unconscious, God, whatever you want to call it, is constantly speaking to us, and it wants us to speak back, and that produces a harmony. You could call it a harmony with the universe, because what it's going to speak of is everything that's important to it as the feeling self and the prophetic self. And what it wants back is our honor and our recognition. And I said before that I've come to believe that the unconscious, the soul, whatever you want to think of it, should be treated as a brother. You don't have to believe everything the brother tells you. Those of you who've had brothers know, I don't know, but you have to pay attention to it, and you should honor and you should love the brother, and in fact respect the brother. That's what brothers are. They're not strangers, but they can change complexion. That's the unconscious can be unruly. It's kind of moving around, has an attitude that might be strange to you, believe me. But you have to honor that, and you have to accept that what it's saying to you is true to the soul. You have to honor it, and you honor it by acknowledging it and saying it back to the soul. Again, the words aren't important. It's the feeling engendered by the rhythmic, metaphoric story that you come back, and only humans create those. I'm sorry, all you scientists, you got it wrong. This is the only thing that's important, is the storyteller. Everything is a story. Everything. This is a story. This is one more you'll add to your collection of stories, and you'll flush it out if you find it's not entertaining, or it's not that important, or what the hell is he talking about, so on and so forth, Let me say just a couple of things that may help you to understand why poetry exists. Many of these thoughts, in fact, aren't my own. The fact that the soul and the self are in constant dialogue and need to be, meaning the unknowable part of us and the knowable part of us. You can think of the unknowable part of us as all of a lake beneath the glittery surface. The glittery surface is consciousness, and if you look at the consciousness, it will reflect the entire world, the sky and the moon, the stars, the bugs, your face when you look in. So that's something that... I just got a little Twitter here. There's some from somebody called Dog Misty, and I think that's my partner in Soul Speak, and she's given me some words. Let me show you a technique that we use. It can be done with pictures too, but it's something that we use in words, and I'm going to paste the words on the screen. I'm going to do a spontaneous poem for you. Let's see if I can do this, if I know how to do it. And we're going to look at the text here. Let me just grab the color, and we're going to make it 20 points, which I think we want to make it. And we're going to bring it up on the screen. This is a technique that we evolved when we started to do spontaneous poetry, a bunch of us here. Oral poetry. There's no books on it. But we knew people had done it in the past, so we stumbled through, and we finally found if we surrendered to it, when the poem started to come out, if we let the unconscious have its way. It doesn't want to do fancy 3 chickens on a hill, I'm scratching my nose, where's my Aunt Margaret, heaven help us. Not that kind of poem. It wants to come out as a story, just like our dreams come out of a story and our daydreams come out of a story. And if we, in fact, if we let it come out, that in fact the poem would start itself, would complete itself. And the more we get out of the way, that in fact the more that the poem would form itself. It took some doing to trust the fact that the poem would form. But basically what we learn to do is become like pre-literate people, to just turn off our conscious mind and to allow the unconscious to come up and to suggest things to us. And if we allow it to do that, the poem forms itself. I've never seen these words before, so I'll just start out and I'll show you what the poem looks like. I generally do them with music, but in fact I don't have any music, so I'm going to, and let me bring them down a little bit here too. Yeah, that's good. So you can see them here. And the words are hungry, black, heaven, dog, eye, fire, and door. And the words chosen at random by my partner. And what you want to do is you want to pick some very simple words you knew by the time you were 3 or 4, because that's what the unconscious knows. It reverberates to them. This is like, you could paraphrase Castaneda as saying that we're beckoning the muse and hoping that the muse arrives. So we're going to start a story and let the unconscious rule the story as it comes up, and if it catches fire, then we're going to let it catch fire and just let it go to its end. It sometimes can be extremely emotional, and it's generally done with 2 people. However, I'm not going to do it with 2 people because people get, wow, what's going on? But they were generally done in antiphonal fashion, which means that another speaker would let go as well and would respond or add to the poem. It's quite beautiful. It's the oldest form of poetry there is. It's what you see in Tarzan movies. The guys are going around in circles, and their masks on. It's a sad imitation of what really takes place. But that was the earliest form of poetry, where the leader of the tribe would speak something out and the tribe would respond, usually an echo, but it could be anything. And it went on for hours. And the ecstatic effect that it produced is, in fact, I can't even imagine anything in terms of modern poetry coming close to poetry we do today. After all, the glory of poetry is that ecstatic moment. If it didn't come with that, it wouldn't be worth anything, just a pile of words, So, anyway, so let me do this. And I always start these poems out with sometimes in my dreams as a way of reminding myself to close off my conscious mind. And in dreams, anything can happen. So as the unconscious presents images to me in words, sometimes I'll just move my lips. then I'll let it. And the first trick is to say sometimes in my dreams, and let your unconscious guide you to the word that'll be your first statement. You never choose the word ahead of time. So let's see what happens. Sometimes in my dreams, I'm on fire. There's a door inside my heart that just opened, that's burning. I can see inside. It's like an eye that's pulsing back and forth. What's there? Is it heaven, or is it some type of blackness? There's a hunger inside me. It's like a dog. It wants out. It wants to howl, and it wants to cry. And it wants to lie down in a dark place and be quiet for a very long time. A very long time. So that's a poem. I had no idea what it was going to be. My eye went to fire, and that was it. And that opening scene sets the thing. The most important thing in the technique is to move into the fire, or to move into the first statement. You can never stand outside these poems. You have to move into them. So that gives you some idea of that, and what it can be, and how fast it is, and how it comes out, just like that. Whatever is on the heart's mind, the soul's mind, the mind of the unconscious, whatever you want to call it, comes out, and in fact allows you to this is a technique that kind of baits it to come up. You can think of the words as like a string in a rock candy formation, with the soul supplying the sugar, and on the right circumstances, with the right words, the right string, it just wraps himself right around. It comes right up through your mind and just blows you right to the place that you want to be, which is where you start to become one again with who you really are. I'm going to play a poem to close off. I see we're running a little late. I'm going to just play one here that I'm going to start up, if I could. And it's by Adora, who is Joan Adley, who is a wonderful way. And I'm going to just let you hear this poem as it goes off. We'll kind of close the show. It's called Water. It's bilingual. It's done with a singer from Alamos, Mexico, where I used to go in the winter. We have a house there still. We're trying to move over to the Yucatan right now, called Elvia Figueroa Hurtador. One of the most beautiful voices, just a girl who does hair, and came up to my door once and kind of did sign language. She wanted to record, and I recorded her. It was so moving, I cried while I was doing it. So we're going to have her sing a song that the artwork, if I remember, I think was done by a local Sarasota painter, or it may be a dancer by the name of Susie Wills, who I hope is watching this, who is one of those very talented people you kind of bump into in Soul Speak. We're all artists, you know. Who's a singer and a dancer and an actress and a photographer, and she's very shy about it. She's becoming a minister, you know. She's a soul-driven person, and we're so happy to see her find her roots. But in fact, we really love the artistic work that she did, and we're hoping that she'll keep it up in her ministry. We need more of that, not the yak you get from our spiritual leaders. You know, the great spiritual leaders of the past were artists. Jesus was a great storyteller. He told the best stories, and so was the Quran. And if you go back even further, they were always great artists and storytellers. You know, that's how they moved their people. But anyway, with all that said, and a plug for artists who really need it today, let's have a little bit of Adora. It's something called Water. It's a bilingual poem, so you can hear the Spanish in the song and the English. Let it just fall on you like water. Don't try to figure any of this stuff out. That's a big mistake, believe me. Because the words and the pictures are just the carriers. They're the spear carriers for the emotion, and what you want is the emotion.
Everywhere. I'm drowning in feeling. Like sometimes women do. Water. Holy water. Washes over me. So sweet. So cruel. So warm. So cold. Lift you up. Float on your feelings. Like women do. Feel them wash over you. Like the fluid you were born in. Water. Happiest near the water. It is my element, as much as air. I don't need much, just to see it, just to feel it, just to be it. And my soul sings and cries and loves. It is truly where I come from, and truly where I'm home.
Well, with that wonderful poem, we're going to sign off and we'll see you next week.